All right.
Action.
You can say something?
Action.
Action. Okay. Action. Let's start. Building burp extensions. I'm actually going to talk a little bit more than just building burp extensions. There's a little bit more to this than that. So, first of all, who am I? Senior security consultant with Secure Ideas. And for some reason, my presentation just wants to keep going. I've done a lot. I have a fairly extensive background in software development. And then I got into security several years ago, and I can't say I haven't looked back since. I haven't really wanted to go back into pure security, software development, but I now use those skills to build out tools, scripts, so on and so forth, to make things better for us. And that's, yeah. Open source contributor. So this is part of the reason why I have this talk, is having to write burp extensions. CO2 is one. Correlator is my latest one, which is, I think, is pretty cool. I also have contributions into Laudanum, Mobisec, Samurai Web Testing Framework 3.3 was just released, or was it earlier this week or last week? So, done a lot of that sort of thing. And other than that, runner, musician, and probably the most important point on the slide is that I am a home brewer as well. That's what I do for fun. So this slide has no title. Tools. What I want to do is actually, I'm talking about tools. Think about, first of all, I think I actually recognize most of the people in this room.
Why the fuck aren't there more people at a Burp Suite talk?
That's what I'm saying.
I don't know.
Do people realize what the fuck you can do with this tool?
I don't know.
I mean, seriously.
But that's what I'm going to talk about. Well, you can go get more people.
I will. Dude, Burp Suite is how yes.
Maybe that should have been your title. What the fuck can you do with Burp?
Maybe that would have filled the room a little quicker, yeah. So, so tools. What I wanted to do was start off with just think about all of the tools that you use when you're conducting pen tests. And where do those tools come from? And probably some of the tools that you're thinking about are on this slide here somewhere. So the next question is, what do all of these tools, other than the fact that they are used for pen testing, what do they all have in common? And the answer is, they're all free. Oh, more people coming in. Look at that. Okay, let me just back up one slide. What we're talking about is the stuff that we do for pen testing. Here's some of it, right? We've seen some of these tools before. They're all free, or they have free versions or community versions. And that's really what the crux of this talk is about, is a lot of what we rely on to do our jobs is free stuff. We like free stuff, right? No? You don't like free stuff? Okay, so we like free stuff, and but it's not really free. I mean, it's free to everyone who's using it. It's free as in beer, but somebody has to put in all the effort, right? We have to actually get down. We have to figure out how are we going to write that code that's going to automate this test, or how do we write this script, and so on and so forth. And in the case of this talk, how are we going to write a burp extension that's going to solve some problem for us? So that's basically what I wanted to get to. So let's start off with burp. Everybody know what burp is? Yeah? Everyone's nodding their head. Good. So I don't really have to talk about this slide too much. There is a free version of burp, which is good. We like free. It's an interception proxy. Does a bunch of things. The one that we're going to talk about is the one at the very end. The last arrow there, extender. Right?
Is that free?
Not CO2, no. Extender is part of burp.
So, but I'm saying you can build.
You can build extensions in burp on the free version, yeah. And they have this thing in there, and I'll show it afterwards. The BAP store, which is basically a marketplace, although everything on there is free, for extensions. And it'll tell you on the extension which ones only work with the pro version and which work with both the free and the pro version. Okay, so burp extensions. If you're going to write a burp extension, fortunately, you have options. You don't have to only know Java. You can write them in Ruby if you really want to. I don't know. We have any Ruby people in the room? I don't. I really dislike Ruby. So.
You don't like gems?
Yeah. No. I hate dealing with gems. Every time I install anything with Ruby, I don't know if you run into this. It's always, yeah, you got the wrong gems installed or something.
3.1123A.
Yeah.
Great. Where am I gonna find
So now I got to figure out how to fix this thing, and yeah, I hate dealing with Ruby. Python is an option. You can. It has Jython wrapped around it. You do have to actually download Jython. It's a Java version of Python, basically, because Burp itself is written in Java. So that's the reason why these other things, they work in sort of a container inside of Java. And then there's Java itself. And I'm going to focus on Java for a couple of reasons. One is Burp itself is written in Java. It inherently, it works better with Burp extensions than it does with these other languages. There are some issues with them. And you'll actually see, if you look at the Portswigger website, home of Burp, you'll see there's instructions on there for making this work better with Python or Ruby, which involves actually increasing your memory heap because they tend to actually use up extra memory and not release it ever. So it can be, if you're just running one or two of them, it's not usually a problem. But if you're running a lot of Python or Ruby-based extensions, it can actually exhaust all of the memory on your in your Burp instance and make it crash. So that's not good. So, all right. So what we're going to be talking about is Java. And to do that, hang on a second. We need to use, I just realized one of my slides is out of order. It's free. Java is free. That's good. I built a test case here. So this is a scenario. It's a mechanism that's similar to something I've run into a couple of times recently on pen tests. And the mechanism isn't username harvesting. I just made it into a familiar form. The mechanism is actually a nonce type of mechanism where you can't simply send requests through a fuzzer like Burp Intruder. It just won't work right out of the box. So we have to come up with a way to solve that problem. So let me actually, this will probably be easier if I just show it. So hopefully everything just works on here. So yeah. Can everyone see that? So I have this login screen here, and if you type in a username and a password, yeah. There, okay, here we go. It woke up. So I typed in a user that doesn't exist in the system, and it comes back with this message: no user session with that user. Okay. If I type in, I have a test user account that I've created in here. So this user is in the system. And if you put that one in, you actually get a different message. So this looks like a very classic username harvesting type of flaw, right? So let's pop over to Burp. I'm running everything through Burp. And we'll take a look and see what's happening. Hang on a second. There's the problem. Okay. For some reason, I don't know why, but Burp seems to think that the JSON stuff has to, it's a script response. I'm not sure why. So what's actually happening when I did these two logins, we'll see that the first request, let's go back to, yeah. So here's the first request that I sent with user equals user. And what it's doing is it's making a request for a nonce. And then on the second request, when it logs in, I don't know if you can see this, but what's being submitted is the username again, the password, and the nonce. So on the nonce, there's the nonce, sorry, on the response. It comes back as a JSON, some kind of string. Question?
Yeah. So when I run Burp, I don't know very much about it, but I played with it recently.
Yeah.
I always do intercept, and on really noisy websites, it's annoying because I have to click forward. Are
Yep.
you able to just grab what you're grabbing without having to interact and slow shit down? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So when you're using Burp
I
Suite,
just want to see, right-click, copy as curl, and replay, and do that type.
right, in which case you're actually using the wrong tool inside of Burp.
Okay.
There's a different way to do that, and I'm actually going to show that right now. So first of all, when the first thing you do, anybody does when they get into Burp, once they know what they're doing, is they turn off the intercept. So over here, there's intercept. You'll notice that it's off. And if you go over to options and scroll all the way down to the bottom, there's a enable interception on startup, and you can change that to always disable. For some reason, that's the default that the developer put in there and has never changed despite everybody telling them that that's not the way that you should be using this tool. So, so what you want to do instead is capture your history, like I just did here. Okay, and notice that, I mean, there's this target tab, that's the other thing too. So this gives you a sitemap of what's going on. It has its use, but most of the time I use just the history tab because everything happens in order there here. It's a lot easier to follow.
Without me having to click forward and drop.
Yeah, it captures it here in this history log. So now you have everything. Yep. Everything, every request that proxies through. I have these actually filtered right now, so I'm not showing CSS or images or anything else. So it's a filtered version of that list, but it captures every single request and response that goes through the proxy. And then what you can do is you can right-click and send one over to repeater. Okay, and the repeater, that's where you can modify requests and send it and get a response, send and get a response. The browser is no longer part of the equation. Right? You can just modify the raw request. So that's what you probably want to be doing. So in this case here, if I hit go on this, it responds back with a nonce. If I go again, it responds back with a different nonce. So we can see there in the response, right? So the question is, we have a username harvesting file. Let's say that we have a list of users, and we want to run this list through and see how many of these users are actually in the system. So how are we going to do this? There's a couple of ways. One is you could pull out Python, which is probably what I would normally do in this situation, is just write a quick Python script to do it. But I wanted to show something with the Burp extension, so we'll do that. So, and actually, before I get into that, let me, just for completeness, I'll show the login. Same thing, I'm running it through repeater. But I haven't changed the nonce. So it's going to say no user session with that user. And even if I put in test for the user, which we already tested on the actual interface, and I hit go there, I'm still going to get no user session with that user. So unless we get the nonce correct, it's going to always respond the same way, and that's not what we're looking for. We want something that's going to tell us whether or not the user's in system. So to do that, hang on. So to do that, we're going to write a Burp extension. How do you do that? First, you need to pick your language. Ruby, Python, or Java is what we're going to do. So for Java, the best tool out there to use is IntelliJ. IntelliJ, there's a couple reasons for this. First of all, this is the tool that Portswigger uses to build Burp. I asked them about this. This is their integrated development environment. So we know that it works. It provides an easy drag and drop way to make interfaces. For those of you who have seen CO2 before, that entire interface was built drag and drop. I didn't have to write any custom code for that. It was actually, the interface part was pretty straightforward. Hooking up all the logic took a little bit more effort, but the interface wasn't too bad. So we want to do, that's one reason. The second one is they have a free community version, and we like free. So it's a commercial tool. The community version works just fine. It's not disabled in any way that prevents us from writing Burp extensions. So works well. So the first thing what we'll want to do is we create a new project in there. And then once you create the project, so I'm actually calling this one a nonce payload processor, and I'll get to why we're calling it that shortly. But what we need to do is we need to actually include the Burp libraries. Now, if you're writing this if you're writing it as a Python, or I don't know about the Ruby actually, but I know for Python you don't have to go through this type of step. You can just start writing your Python script and you just subclass the same classes that are in the API. The API doesn't change no matter what language you're using. So, but anyway, what we'll do in this case, so we create a project, and then what we need to do is add an additional module, because in order for everything to compile, it needs to be able to see the Burp APIs. All right, so what you'll do is you'll create this other module, call it Burp API or whatever you want, and then hook that up so that it basically your structure looks like this window down here afterwards. So you have two modules. One is the Burp interfaces, and then the second one is your actual code, and which right now is empty. Okay. Now, where do we get the Burp APIs from? They're actually inside of Burp. That's the easiest way to get to them. So you just go to the Burp Extender APIs tab, and then you'll see down at the bottom, I don't know if I can, yeah, there we go. Down at the bottom, you have two buttons. One is for the JavaDoc files, so you can save those locally. And the other one is save interface files. So what you'll do is take those, save them into that Burp API folder. And it's best practice to do this each time because the APIs change with the versions, so you want to make sure that you have the latest version. Once that's in there, you open up your module settings. I know this is kind of technical, but if you're looking to do this later on, you can go back to this video and figure out how. So open the module settings, and what you'll want to do is go into it's a little bit hard to see here, the nonce payload processor module inside of IntelliJ, and make sure that your Burp APIs are a dependency of building your actual extension. Okay. So the reason we do this is that way everything compiles. That means your extension can actually see all of the interfaces that you're using from Burp. So one more step in the configuration, and then it gets onto the actual fun stuff. So the last thing that you'll want to do is go into the Artifacts tab. This is still under the module settings. And basically set it up so that it creates, down here, you have this build on make. What you want to do is you want to create a jar file. That's the artifact. The jar file is what you're going to upload to Burp so that it has the extension. So that's how it's packaged. So you can, once you set all of this up inside of IntelliJ, it basically run make. It automatically compiles everything, creates the jar file, and it's ready to import into Burp. So. Okay. So taking a step back, let's think about the problem that we're trying to solve now that we have our project structure in place. And the problem is we want to be able to capture a nonce so that we can submit that into a login form so we can determine whether or not the user exists. So to do that, we're going to need some help from Burp. We need to have some way to plug into it. So they have these interfaces that have been set up in the API. And the main one that we're going to use is this one here, iBurp Extender. So if you're building a Burp extension, it's weird that it's called iBurp Extender, not iBurp Extension, but that's what it is. So every Burp extension implements this interface here, and all it has is one method on there: register extender callbacks. And I'll get to what that looks like in just a second. Some other important ones to consider: the actual callbacks interface. So this is what lets you interact with Burp itself, get into calling all the tools, so on and so forth. Also, if you want to write anything to standard out or to the output within Burp, that's what you're going to call. You also have your helpers. So that's for actually creating, manipulating requests or requests and responses inside of Burp as well. So there's also some decoding and encoding routines, setting scanner insertion points and things like that. So miscellaneous functionality in there. So those are basically, that's all there is for the main support classes. So you have extender, you have callbacks, and you have helpers. Then the types of things that you can actually do with an extension, so you might be thinking, okay, well, what kinds of problems can I solve? You can plug into everything that's there. So all of the tools that are available inside of Burp, there's ways to interact with those programmatically. So we can interact with the actual proxy itself. So basically, we can get every single request and response that goes through the proxy. We can get a handle on that and do something to it, change it, manipulate it, analyze it, maybe log new issues. We can generate payloads. Okay, so I've done some of that before. One CO2 has a generator in there where you can pass it a list of user information, and then it'll start fuzzing off that list and create like passwords. It'll do leet speak type of insertions in places and stuff like that. So it's pretty cool. And then there's a payload processor, which is taking an existing payload and making some changes to it. And that's actually what we're going to use for this problem. A few other things you can do. You can add issues. So that's a pro version only, right? So it has the scan issues on there, so you can actually create new issues. You can also add editor tabs, change some of the behavior of the tabs that are there. You can manipulate session handling logic as well. So you can do a bunch of things. So payload processor. So we have, it has two functions on there. This is directly snapshot off of the API docs. We can get the name of the processor. And then it's process payload. And it takes 3 values here, and it returns a byte array. So basically the only parts of this we're going to use is we're going to take the current payload. So that's going to be the username that we're passing into the function. And then what we're going to return is the nonce. So we need some way to fetch that nonce. And the easiest way to do that is to make an HTTP request. And it just so happens that there's a function inside of the callbacks for making HTTP requests using Burp's own HTTP stack. Right. So you can just use that directly. And I think what we'll do is take a look at what that looks like. So here's IntelliJ. And I know it's probably very tiny on that screen. It is. I don't know if there's any way to make this larger. No, it just zooms the whole window. What's that?
Is that Stego? Because I can't read anything.
He doesn't want to give out all his secrets.
I don't want to give out all the secrets.
A yellow, and 2 greens. You're good.
All right. So I will briefly explain what's on here, and I think what I'll do is I'll just make this available afterwards, so you guys can take a look at the actual source code. So what I did is I took a request, one of the requests that we're sending to the nonce, and basically pasted it in here as a template. And this is the request to get the nonce. Okay. Then I did in register callbacks. Just basically said, hey, I want to register a intruder payload processor. And this is it here. And then down here is that process payload function. And all I'm doing with that is it's taking the username, so that current payload parameter, that first parameter that I showed in the function. And it's actually constructing that request for the nonce, sending it out, getting the response, taking the nonce out of the response, and then returning that as the new payload. So it's basically swapping out a username for a nonce. Okay? And that's all it's doing. So how does this look inside of Burp? I actually have one set up. So for those who have looked at Burp before, sometimes you're wondering, the attack type. There's all these different types of attack types. Remember this? So the first one on there, sniper, is the default. That's what we almost always use. This is one of those situations. We need to submit the current username, a password, and the nonce, which is actually the username using our payload processor that's been changed into a nonce. So we have a situation now where we need to initially submit the username twice in 2 different positions. To do that, we use Pitchfork. Right? So now here's a use case for using Pitchfork. This is the first one I've ever found. Maybe not the first one, but we can use Pitchfork. So on the first payload set, I just put together a list of usernames. On the second payload set, it's the same list of usernames, because that's how Pitchfork works, is you want to have pairs of things submitted. In this case here, I want the same ones, because the second one I'm going to change into the nonce.
Have you had any threshold limits with Burp on your list size?
No. Have you?
No, I just, because I think some of the lists that we have, I start looking at them, I'm like,
They're huge.
These are huge. Like,
Yeah.
I love tools, but eventually something's just going to be like, you needed 2 more purples in there for me to be able to process this.
Well, yeah, and here's the thing. If you run into a case where, let's say you're pulling payloads off of some other tool or something, so it could be an infinite list, that's when you want a payload generator. Because you can make that memory efficient so that it doesn't generate an entire list first. It just generates them as you need them.
I was just curious, because I haven't.
I haven't.
Every day, I use it, I'm like, this is going to be the day.
It's got 10,000 items on this list. No.
Spray and pray.
So, and now let me go, I'll just remove this and add it back in so you can see it. So the payload processor for the second one, all you do is you add the payload processing, and then there are a bunch of different options here. So if you ever end up in a situation where you need to do some type of encoding or something to a list, this is where you do it. And at the very last one here is invoke Burp extension. And, oh, mine's not there, actually. Hang on. It's not there because we actually need to add it in. So on the Burp extensions, I need to go find my file, which is, hang on, I'll find it in a second. It's buried. Building Burp extensions, there we are. And there's the jar. So I went and found the jar that I created. And hit go, and there it is. So it's loaded. All right, and so now it shows up on my list here at the bottom. And then it also shows up inside of Intruder. So I can add the payload processor, invoke Burp extension, not payloader is what I called it, because in Burp everything ends in ER. I don't know if you ever noticed that. So I try to stick with it. So now we have that. So now if I start the attack, you'll see that I have 2 payloads. The first one, now it's going slowly because I having to make these extra requests. The first one is from the first part of the Pitchfork, how I'm putting in 2 lists. The second one is after the payload's been processed, and so that's why we have the nonce on there. So, and of course we have a couple with the length coming up differently. And I don't know if you can read those, but the usernames are Kevin and Jason. So those are the users in this system.
Completely random, of course.
Completely random, yes. So. Right. So that's that. Any questions? Other than, you couldn't actually see the code or anything like that, so because it was too small. I will post this afterwards, along with the code sample, so you can take a look at that, how that actually really worked. One other thing I want to show, because we have a little bit of extra time, which I was hoping we would, is Correlator. I know probably some of you have seen the CO2 stuff before. Correlator, I think, is actually an extremely valuable tool at making us more efficient at what we do. Oh wait, I think I actually have some slides on this. Let me switch over to that.
Is the pro version worth the money you spent on it?
Yes.
Absolutely.
$300.
Well, yeah. If you actually do pen testing, absolutely.
You write it off in one client, and that's
Yeah.
1 hour, right?
Yeah.
Maybe 2, depending on
Yeah,
how cheap they are. 3 if it's a government agency.
Exactly. So, yeah, I think it is. One of the biggest comparisons you see out there is Zap versus Burp, because Zap's OWASP's free tool, and it is very good as well. So a lot of it is personal preference. I find Burp to be a little bit more intuitive. It's easier to kind of switch between the tools, so you can take payload, or not payloads, you can take requests and responses from one tool and get them into other tools very quickly and easily. So I find I work with it more efficiently than I do with Zap.
You don't present it as a standalone. It's meant to be an augmentation to your process and workflow rather than just kind of like, hey, just click here, we're all in one.
Yeah.
It also doesn't crash as frequently.
It's true. It doesn't crash as frequently. So, those are all good reasons. And I mean, if you don't do actual pen testing very often, if you're just playing around with it, hobbyist, whatever, then maybe it isn't worth it.
$300, huh?
But for $300, if you do any pen testing, it is.
Yep.
Yeah.
Lifetime?
So no, that's per year.
It's per year. It is per year. But I mean, the community edition, the chances are you're going to be able to do the vast majority of everything you want to do. Maybe it's a couple extra steps. A couple extra things. So write some extensions.
Yeah.
Write some scripts.
Write some extensions to do the stuff that it doesn't. Yeah. It's possible, I guess. So correlator, basically what it does is it's automatic analysis of the parameters. And when I say parameters, I mean everything. So post parameters, get parameters, cookies, basically everything that Burp understands as a parameter. And the types of things that it recognizes is anything that's URL encoded, it'll decode it automatically for you. Base64 encoding, it'll recognize if something looks like a path. It'll say, hey, yeah, it looks like this is a path. HTML, XML fragments, email addresses, social security numbers if it sees something that looks like that. One that's not on here is credit cards, although I seem to be currently having an issue with it's supposed to run the LUN algorithm on there to actually determine if it's a valid credit card number, and I'm not 100% sure it's working. And it'll currently also decode big IPs cookies. So if it runs across a big IP cookie, it'll decode that into the IP addresses. So all of this stuff, it basically does automatically. And I eventually want it to do more. Now, the purpose of this isn't, okay, I'm doing a quick little test. Let me just run it through this. Question?
What's the big IP?
So big IP is basically does the load balancing. Yes, that's the word I'm looking for. Load balancing. And so it does it through this cookie mechanism. But there's a known flaw in most configurations of big IP that I've seen anyway, where the internal IP address, I think it's the internal IP address that's exposed inside the cookie. It's in an encoded format, but being encoded and not encrypted, there's a way to decode it, and then you can actually see the IP addresses. So it's just an information disclosure vulnerability. It's not a huge deal, but it does give somebody an idea of, okay, this is what the load balancer is on the internal network.
Nice little footprint.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yep. So normally where you would use correlator is if you're testing a whole bunch of websites, or if you're testing like a very large complex website that has a whole lot of stuff on it. Hang on, I'm going to change my scope here. And I just ran some demo stuff through it earlier so that we could kind of get an idea of what it looks like, some of the output. And that's basically all I did. So all it does is it goes through everything that you've marked as in scope for your test. And that's why you saw me pop over to the target tab for a second and I changed the scope. So everything that's marked in scope, it goes through all of those requests, looks at all the parameters, and then it starts figuring out what's what. And then it puts it all in a nice table for you. Now in this case here, you can still see that all of this over here still looks in it's all in its original form, so that may not be helpful. It does have the format down here of what it's figured out it is. But then I actually just figured recently, hey, why don't we just go ahead and do the decoding right there in the table? So now it'll actually decode those values right there in the table. If you click on one of these, like let's say foo, for example, this one here says 75% of the instances that it ran across were MD5. So it's probably an MD5. And if you go down onto the details here, it'll actually list them off, all the unique values. You can list every single one if you want, but it'll list off all the unique values. You just click on one of those, and you can see it'll walk through how did it figure out that this is MD5. And it says, but basically it looks like a hex string. It's a length 32, which is commonly MD5. Some of the other ones, this one here, you see the starting value on that? It's this huge string. And I've actually run into stuff like this before. It's this huge string of gobbledygook. And it figured out on its own, hey, this needs to be base 64 decoded, then URL decoded, then URL decoded again, and then yeah, finally it looks like something that's a printable string, right? So the end values may be interesting in this case. Also, paths, it would determine if something looks like a path, or in this case here, we have something that started off as base 64 encoded block of stuff, and it figured out, hey, this is actually XML or HTML. I mean, that's what it looks like to me. So, and then it decoded it for us too. So, and it is. Turns out this is an HTML fragment. So this type of information, if you're looking at a huge test, being able to break it down like this very quickly, you can separate the interesting bits of information from the probably not so interesting bits of information very quickly. It's a table. It's all sortable, all the tabs you can, so if you have a really long list, you can say, okay, let me just look at everything that looks like an MD5. Let's look at all the SHA-1s. Let's look at everything that looks like an XML fragment, because that's a good spot for injection possibly, right? If you have XML fragments going in, let's see if I can put a script tag in there. And it has a couple of other features too. You can highlight where something is on the request. You can right-click on things and say, hey, I want to send this request over to repeater. You can, if you have one case where this works, like let's say you have a bunch of MD5s in there that you think are useful hashes, you can right-click on that and copy that to the clipboard and then paste it into some other tool where you're doing like hash lookups. You can do that sort of thing with there pretty quickly too. So that's basically it. So that's Correlator. That's the latest extension that I've built along with an interface and everything. So I did want to kind of put in a plug for that. I don't think it's on the BAP store yet, although I asked for it to be on the BAP store. You just email them. Yeah.
Is it more than one? Is it more than one person?
For what?
For Burp, you said email them, and you keep on saying them.
Yeah.
One person.
No, it's a company. I've actually interacted with 2 different people, so I know for sure that there's more than one. No, well, yeah, it could be. I was going to say one was male, the other's female, but Three's company. So that's my spiel, and I mean, really what this is hopefully getting people somewhat interested. If you see any issues with plugins or tools as you're using them, try to be, I mean, first of all, let the author know, hey, something's not working right. I'm not sure why the latest version seems to be broken. But be polite about it too, and realize that most of the time, most of us are actually doing this on our own time, in addition to the 60 or 80-hour weeks that we're pulling. So, question?
Are you offering a bounty?
I'll give you recognition. So, yeah, I'll give you a big thanks on Twitter or something. But yeah. So.
Hashtag you found the purple error.
Yeah. Any questions? Yeah, good stuff. All right.
Are you interested in, so I know you obviously collaborated. Where do you think you're going to expand them on, or do you feel like that is functionally where you're going to take it?
Well, I would like to do, that's a good question. So where do I want to go with Collaborator next? I think I want to improve on what's there. One of the things I'm really looking for feedback, if anybody is doing a pen test and you run into some kind of encoding that it doesn't handle, do let me know, and let me know what the decoding is that you needed to figure out, because that's the sort of thing that I'm only adding functionality as I run into it in pen tests.
Let me know what you know.
So exactly. Yeah.
Have you thought about maybe creating a function for submission?
The submission function. Yeah. No, I don't need that. But yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, if you use it and you find anything with this, I mean, same thing with CO2 too. So. Thanks.